The year is 1871. Inside a dimly lit prison cell in Auburn, New York, a man sits hunched over a pile of books, his eyes burning with a strange intensity. His name is Edward H. Rulloff, a man condemned to die. To the guards, he is a murderer awaiting execution. To some scholars, he is a man of profound genius, a linguist who claimed to be on the verge of unlocking the mysteries of a universal language. To his victims' families, he is a monster who left behind only grief and unanswered questions. This paradox, brilliance wrapped in blood, has haunted every chapter of Edward Rulloff's life. He was a man who could lecture on science and philosophy with elegance, and in the same breath could commit acts of violence without remorse. A man who believed his towering intellect placed him above the laws of society, yet found himself shackled by those very laws, time and time again. Edward Rulloff's story unfolds not only as a tale of murder, but as a chilling study of the dangers of unchecked ego, arrogance, and obsession. How does a man gifted with such rare intelligence descend into darkness so absolute? Was he a victim of his own brilliance, driven mad by the weight of his ideas, or was his genius merely a mask hiding a soul inclined to cruelty from the beginning? In the mid-19th century, America was in flux. The Civil War had reshaped the nation, science and industry were rapidly advancing, and intellectual circles buzzed with talk of discovery and progress. Against this backdrop emerged Rulloff, a man whose name would become infamous, both whispered in admiration and spat out in disgust. By the time of his execution in 1871, he had become one of the most notorious criminals in American history. Newspapers called him the Genius Killer, a title that perfectly captured the contradiction of his existence. Some compared him to Faust, the scholar who sold his soul to darkness. Others simply labeled him a dangerous fraud. This script will journey through his life in 25 sections, tracing his rise and fall. We begin with his humble beginnings in Canada, follow his pursuit of knowledge, uncover his manipulative schemes, and explore the murders that sealed his fate. Along the way, we will confront unsettling questions. Can intellect excuse evil? Can brilliance blind a society to obvious danger? And how far should humanity go in celebrating genius when it comes tainted with blood? Edward Rulloff's life reminds us that history is not merely made of heroes and villains, but of deeply complex figures who force us to reckon with the shadowy spaces between. Edward Rulloff was born in 1819, though later reports often confuse dates, with some citing 1820 or 1821, in St. John, New Brunswick, Canada. He grew up in a modest household, part of a family that valued hard work more than intellectual pursuits. From his earliest years, Edward stood apart. While other children chased games in the fields, he immersed himself in books, displaying an uncanny memory and a voracious appetite for knowledge. Neighbors recalled that he could memorize long passages of text after only a single reading. He studied languages obsessively, Latin, Greek, and later German and French, absorbing knowledge as though his mind were a sponge designed for nothing else. Yet alongside this gift, there was always something unsettling about him. He rarely played with others, kept secrets, and exhibited a cold, calculating nature even as a child. Edward's family was strict, and discipline was harsh in his home. Some historians speculate that this environment shaped his duplicity, outwardly obedient, inwardly rebellious. To the outside world, he appeared as a prodigy destined for scholarly greatness. Inside, however, he was nurturing a growing contempt for authority and a belief in his own superiority. By his teenage years, Edward was already displaying signs of what modern psychology might call narcissistic tendencies. He often belittled those he considered intellectually inferior, which was nearly everyone. Teachers found him brilliant but impossible to manage. His peers admired his memory, but avoided him for his arrogance. It was in these early years that the seeds of his double life were planted. On one side, the gifted scholar; on the other, a young man quietly cultivating deceit, manipulation, and a dangerous disregard for human connection. By the time Edward reached adulthood, his ambitions had crystallized. He was not content merely to be educated. He wanted to be remembered as one of history's greatest minds. His obsession centered on the idea of creating a universal language, a linguistic system that could unite all human beings across cultures and nations. This obsession consumed him. He worked tirelessly, filling notebooks with theories and linguistic structures. His intellect was undeniable, but so too was his arrogance. He believed his discovery would eclipse the works of philosophers, scientists, and theologians. To him, society was blind, failing to recognize his genius. Edward began teaching to support himself. His students often spoke of his captivating lectures, his deep knowledge, and his passion for learning. But behind closed doors, many also saw a darker side: impatience, bursts of temper, and a manipulative streak. He used his position as a teacher not just to educate but to exert control, often bending others to his will. The scholarly world of the 19th century was not easily accessible. Publishing required connections and resources that Edward lacked. Time and again, his attempts to gain recognition were ignored or dismissed. Instead of humbling him, rejection fueled his bitterness. He began to view himself as a misunderstood genius, surrounded by fools incapable of appreciating his brilliance. This arrogance became the justification for his darker deeds. In Edward's mind, the rules of ordinary men did not apply to him. If theft, manipulation, or even violence were necessary to advance his work, then so be it. After all, what was the suffering of a few compared to the progress of mankind? Edward's descent into crime began with small acts, but they revealed a dangerous pattern. He was arrested for theft and fraud on multiple occasions, using his intellect not only to charm but to deceive. He could talk his way out of situations with remarkable ease, weaving lies so convincing that many never suspected the truth until it was too late. He lived a transient life, moving frequently to escape suspicion. Each town seemed to leave behind rumors, stories of missing money, strange behavior, or unexplained disappearances, yet nothing ever stuck firmly enough to bring him lasting punishment. What frightened many was not just his actions, but the cold calculation behind them. Unlike common criminals driven by desperation, Edward seemed to commit crimes almost as a sport, as though testing his ability to outwit society. His double life grew sharper, the scholar by day, the manipulator and thief by night. Friends who once admired him began to distance themselves. Parents who had trusted him as a teacher grew uneasy. The whispers followed him from town to town. There was something not quite right about Edward Rulloff. But even as suspicion mounted, Edward's confidence never wavered. He believed himself untouchable, destined for greatness. That belief would soon push him into far darker territory. The defining moment of Edward's descent came in the early 1840s, when he married Harriet Schute, a young woman from Dryden, New York. At first, their marriage seemed ordinary, though friends noted Edward's controlling and secretive nature. Harriet, bright and hopeful, appeared unaware of the storm she had entered. Edward's obsession with his work and his growing paranoia soon poisoned the relationship. He demanded obedience, isolated her from friends, and reportedly grew increasingly violent. Then, in 1845, Harriet and their infant daughter suddenly vanished. Edward claimed his wife had left him, but whispers of murder quickly spread. Neighbors remembered strange behavior, a restless energy around Edward's home, and Harriet's abrupt disappearance with no trace. Many suspected he had killed her, but there was no body, no proof. This disappearance became the great mystery of Edward's life. Some believe he strangled Harriet in a fit of rage and disposed of her body in nearby waters. Others argue he carefully planned her death, viewing her as an obstacle to his grand ambitions. Regardless, what is clear is that Harriet never returned, and Edward showed little grief. For the community, this was the moment when suspicion turned to fear. They were no longer dealing with a clever thief or arrogant scholar, but with a man who might be capable of murder. Edward, for his part, moved on quickly, continuing his scholarly pursuits and criminal activities as though nothing had happened, but the shadow of Harriet's disappearance followed him forever. It marked the true beginning of his identity as the genius killer. The disappearance of Harriet Schute, Edward Rulloff's young wife, marked a turning point not only in his personal life but also in the way the world began to perceive him. Before Harriet's vanishing in 1845, Edward was considered an eccentric scholar, a man with a peculiar arrogance but undeniable intelligence. After Harriet, he became a man surrounded by whispers of murder, someone whose brilliance could no longer distract people from the growing darkness around him. Yet, as was so often the case with Rulloff, suspicion did not translate into immediate consequences. With no body and no proof, the law remained powerless, and Edward, believing himself once again beyond the reach of ordinary men, moved forward as if nothing had happened. In Dryden, New York, neighbors continued to speculate about Harriet's fate. Some believed Edward had murdered her in a sudden rage. Others whispered of a carefully planned act of disposal, and a few still clung to the hope that she had run away to escape his suffocating control. But all agreed on one thing: Edward's behavior in the days and weeks after her disappearance was unnatural. Rather than grieving, he doubled down on his scholarly pursuits. He immersed himself in his notes on linguistics, spending nights scribbling furiously by candlelight. When questioned about Harriet, he offered vague answers or redirected conversations back to his intellectual projects. To those who pressed him harder, he insisted Harriet had gone to visit relatives and would return when she was ready. Of course, she never did. This odd composure, this lack of visible sorrow left a chilling impression. It was as though Harriet had been erased from his life not just physically but emotionally, reduced to a footnote in Edward's obsessive march toward intellectual glory. By the late 1840s, Edward was once again moving between towns, always under the pretense of pursuing work as a teacher or tutor. He had a remarkable ability to present himself as respectable, even admirable. To the casual observer, he was an educated man trying to make a living in a world that often undervalued intellect. His carefully chosen words, his polished manner of speaking, and his evident knowledge won him employment in schools and homes alike. But beneath this surface lay a different story. Edward was never far from trouble. Wherever he went, stories emerged of theft, deceit, and manipulation. He took advantage of families who welcomed him into their homes, sometimes disappearing with valuables, other times sowing confusion and mistrust. He seemed to thrive on chaos, as if proving once again that his intellect could outmaneuver the ordinary morality of society. It was during this wandering period that Edward began to draw other men into his orbit. His charisma and intelligence, for all their unsettling edges, were powerful tools of persuasion. He convinced a few impressionable young men that society had wronged them, that the world offered little to men of ambition unless they were willing to take what they deserved. Among those who became closest to him were William and Jarvis, brothers who fell under his spell. Edward presented himself as a mentor, someone who could guide them not just in knowledge, but in life. But his guidance came at a terrible cost. Rather than elevating them, he pulled them into a world of crime. This was the beginning of Edward's transformation from a solitary manipulator into the leader of a small criminal band. And while he told his companions that their work together would finance his scholarly projects, the truth was simpler. Edward needed accomplices to carry out increasingly daring acts of theft and deception. By the mid-1850s, Edward Rulloff had shed any illusions of being a solitary scholar struggling against the world. He was now something far more dangerous, the head of a small but loyal band of outlaws who believed in his leadership. Edward did not simply recruit men to commit crimes, he convinced them they were taking part in something greater. To his followers, Edward was more than a criminal mastermind. He was a visionary. The men he gathered, often younger, impressionable, and hungry for wealth, were drawn to his charisma. He dazzled them with tales of his linguistic project, a universal language that would supposedly make him immortal in the annals of history. But between these lofty visions, Edward whispered promises of quick profits, stolen goods, and power. Thus was born his small band of thieves and accomplices. They would break into stores, steal from merchants, and traffic goods across county lines. Edward was the planner, the strategist, the one whose intellect made every scheme appear foolproof. His companions, eager for both money and the approval of their brilliant leader, carried out much of the dangerous work. Though Harriet's disappearance had occurred years earlier, Edward could not fully escape its shadow. In Dryden, the Schute family, Harriet's relatives, remained convinced he had murdered her. They had pressed authorities, pleaded with lawmen, and spread word of their suspicions, but the lack of evidence kept the case stagnant. Edward seemed to revel in this unresolved tension. The more he escaped consequences, the more his arrogance grew. In private moments, he allegedly told his followers that he had outwitted everyone, that no man could tie him to Harriet's death. To him, it was proof that his mind operated on a higher level than those who sought to catch him. Edward's band expanded its operations throughout upstate New York. Towns like Ithaca, Binghamton, and smaller villages became targets. Dry goods stores, grocers, and local merchants soon learned to fear nightfall, for in the morning their locks might be broken and their shelves emptied. Unlike common burglars, Edward often treated these operations like intellectual exercises. He studied store layouts, planned entry and exit routes, and timed strikes with precision. He prided himself on creating perfect plans, as if each crime were a thesis he intended to defend. But perfection was an illusion. Mistakes happened. Sometimes townsfolk spotted suspicious men loitering in the dark. Sometimes stolen goods were traced back to Edward's circle. Each close call should have been a warning. Instead, Edward interpreted them as challenges to overcome, puzzles meant to sharpen his brilliance. To his followers, Edward was both teacher and tyrant. He lectured them on philosophy, language, and history, giving the impression that they were not mere thieves, but apprentices of a great mind. At night around campfires, he could expound for hours on his theories of language, filling his companions with awe. But when it came to their loyalty, Edward was merciless. Dissent or hesitation was met with scorn. If a follower questioned a plan, Edward would ridicule him, declaring that only a fool would fail to see the genius in his strategy. He cultivated dependency. His companions both feared and admired him, unable to imagine their lives outside his shadow. By 1849, Edward's ambitions culminated in one of his most infamous crimes, the Binghamton store robbery. It began, as so many of his schemes did, with a promise. This heist, Edward told his men, would be the one to secure enough money to fund his great linguistic work. It would not be mere theft. It would be the turning point of history. The target was a dry goods store owned by a merchant named Myron Casper. The plan was to break in after hours, loot the store, and vanish before sunrise. Edward orchestrated every detail, entry points, timing, getaway. As always, he was the mastermind. His men were the instruments. But on the night of the robbery, things went wrong. Casper and his clerks discovered the burglars mid-act. A confrontation ensued. According to later reports, Edward's men panicked. Blows were exchanged. In the chaos, at least one store clerk was struck fatally. Blood stained the floor of the Binghamton store, and the crime crossed a line from theft to murder. The community was horrified. Petty burglary was one thing, tragic but common. Murder during a robbery was something far darker. The newspapers exploded with outrage. Suddenly, Edward's name was linked not just to suspicion of Harriet's disappearance, but to undeniable bloodshed. Authorities launched a manhunt. Edward and his accomplices scattered. Some were caught quickly, others vanished. Edward, ever the manipulator, managed once again to evade immediate capture. He moved under false names, slipped across counties, and reinvented himself as he always had. But his infamy was sealed. For the first time, the label "Genius Killer" appeared in print. The contradiction fascinated and repulsed the public. How could a man who wrote on linguistics and lectured on science also orchestrate murder? Was this proof that intellect without morality led only to destruction? The Binghamton robbery marked a critical shift. Edward was no longer merely a criminal with suspicions of violence attached to his name. He was now known as a man of blood. Someone who could not be dismissed as eccentric or misunderstood. Yet, even this did not break him. In private, Edward rationalized the death as necessary. If a clerk stood between him and the progress of his work, then the clerk's life was a price worth paying. To Edward, his linguistic project justified anything. Theft, betrayal, murder. There were no limits. In the wake of Binghamton, Edward's myth grew. To some, he was a monster. To others, he was a tragic figure, a man whose brilliance had curdled into madness. But to Edward himself, he remained what he had always believed, a genius above the laws of men. The Binghamton robbery had left Edward's gang scattered and his reputation tainted with blood. Authorities intensified their pursuit, and one by one, many of his accomplices were captured. Edward, however, proved more elusive. His ability to slip through the cracks of the justice system seemed almost supernatural. He reinvented himself in towns where his name was unknown, teaching under false identities, presenting himself as a man of letters rather than a criminal mastermind. But by the early 1850s, luck began to thin. Edward was finally arrested, tried, and sentenced for burglary. The authorities, while unable to convict him for the murder linked to the Binghamton robbery, at least had him behind bars. For the Schute family and others who still believed Harriet's disappearance had been his doing, it was a bittersweet victory. He was not convicted of the crime they wanted most, but at last he was contained. Yet prison for Edward was not a punishment. It was an inconvenience. More importantly, it was a stage. Inside the stone walls of Auburn prison, Edward Rulloff became both an object of fascination and fear. Guards and fellow inmates alike remarked on his uncanny intelligence. He conversed fluently in multiple languages, dissected philosophical questions, and lectured on science. To some, he seemed out of place, a scholar unjustly confined. To others, his arrogance and coldness marked him as dangerous beyond measure. What set Edward apart was not merely his intellect, but his ability to manipulate perception. He cultivated an image of a misunderstood genius, one whose only crime was thinking differently from ordinary men. He convinced sympathetic visitors and even some officials that he was more scholar than criminal. "My work on a universal language," he would tell them, "is of more importance than all the petty matters you call crimes." In a way, he was right. His linguistic obsession consumed him. For decades, Edward had been developing a grand theory of language. He believed he could create a system that unlocked the roots of all human speech, a universal code to unite mankind. He scribbled notes, drafted manuscripts, and spoke with evangelical fervor about his project. But behind this lofty vision lurked the same cold pragmatism. Crime was his fuel. He needed freedom, money, and resources to complete his work. If that required burglary, or worse, so be it. Prison could not hold such a man. By the mid-1850s, Edward escaped. Accounts vary, but his sharp mind, combined with his ability to persuade and deceive, opened doors. Whether by exploiting a guard's trust, finding physical weaknesses in the prison itself, or forging the right papers, Edward once again outwitted the system. His reappearance on the outside was both shocking and inevitable. Communities that remembered his name trembled. Others, hearing it for the first time, learned quickly of the educated criminal. He gathered new followers, often younger men, enthralled by his intellect and charisma. They fell under his sway as the earlier brothers had, lured by his vision of a future where crime was justified by genius. Edward's return was not one of quiet rehabilitation. He resumed his dual existence, teacher and thief, scholar and outlaw, but this time the stakes were higher. He was older, more infamous, and more desperate. Years of imprisonment had not humbled him. They had hardened him. By the 1860s, Edward was orchestrating more robberies. He led new companions into burglaries across upstate New York, always seeking greater hauls to fund his linguistic obsession. But cracks showed in his control. His arrogance grew, his threats more violent. Those who followed him did so with increasing fear, not loyalty. And when fear is the glue of leadership, betrayal is inevitable. The genius killer had returned, but this time, his path led inexorably toward his final, blood-soaked downfall. The late 1860s brought Edward Rulloff into the most infamous chapter of his life. His crimes had escalated from burglary and deception to bloodshed, but he had not yet faced the gallows. That would change with the murder of Frederick A. Merrick. Merrick was a store clerk in Binghamton, New York, the same town where Edward had orchestrated robberies years before. By now, Edward had assembled a new band of followers, including a man named Calvin D. Jarvis and other impressionable accomplices. Their goal was a familiar one: loot a store, make off with goods, and profit. But Edward's mind was never satisfied with simple theft. He wanted this job to provide enough wealth to finally complete his linguistic magnum opus. In August 1870, Edward and his gang planned the burglary of a dry goods store where Merrick worked. The plan was to enter at night, overwhelm anyone inside and take everything of value. But as with so many of Edward's schemes, control slipped when reality intruded. Merrick resisted. Witnesses later described the struggle as brief and brutal. Merrick, defending his employer's property, fought against the intruders. In the melee, Edward himself, or one of his close accomplices, delivered the fatal blow. Merrick was struck in the head, collapsing to the floor, lifeless. The store became a crime scene drenched in blood, another ordinary man sacrificed to Edward's delusion of genius. This time there was no escape. Authorities responded with unprecedented force. Edward and his gang were hunted down, arrested and charged. His notoriety guaranteed attention from both the press and the public. No longer was he simply a local curiosity. By 1870, Edward Rulloff had become one of the most notorious criminals in America. The trial that followed was nothing short of sensational. The prosecution painted Edward as a monster, a man whose brilliance had been poisoned by pride, leaving him capable of any atrocity. Witnesses testified to his past crimes, his manipulations, his capacity for violence. Harriet's disappearance, though never proven, was invoked as part of his dark legacy. Edward's defense predictably leaned on his intellect. Lawyers argued that he was no ordinary man, that his contributions to scholarship outweighed his supposed crimes. They painted him as a misunderstood thinker, persecuted by lesser minds. Edward himself, eloquent as always, attempted to sway the jury with speeches about his linguistic work. He insisted that his discoveries would outlast all of them, that history would remember him as a genius, not a killer. But the jury saw through the rhetoric. In 1871, Edward Rulloff was convicted of murder and sentenced to death. The weeks leading up to his execution were filled with macabre fascination. Newspapers across the country published stories about the genius killer. Crowds debated whether he was a madman, a misunderstood scholar, or evil incarnate. His writings on language were examined, some declaring them nonsense, others seeing glimmers of brilliance. On May 18, 1871, Edward Rulloff was led to the gallows in Binghamton. The event drew hundreds, all eager to witness the fall of a man who had straddled the line between genius and monster. True to form, Edward faced death with arrogance. He reportedly declared, "Hurry it up, I want to be in hell in time for dinner." The trapdoor opened. The genius killer was no more. But even in death, Edward Rulloff's story did not end. His head was severed, preserved, and studied by phrenologists who claimed the size of his brain was extraordinary, the second largest ever recorded at the time. To them, it was proof that his intellect had been real, even if twisted. His skull was displayed, a grim relic of the paradox he embodied: brilliance without conscience, genius entwined with blood. Edward Rulloff's legacy lingers as a chilling reminder. Intelligence, unmoored from morality, is not salvation, but damnation. His universal language was never completed. Edward's execution did not close his story. Instead, it amplified it. On May 18, 1871, as his body swung from the gallows in Binghamton, newspapers across the United States rushed to print their accounts. The genius killer had been hanged, but his contradictions, his mind, his crimes, his arrogance, were far from resolved. The public reaction was divided. For many, the execution was long overdue justice. They remembered Harriet Schute, whose body was never found. They remembered Frederick Merrick, bludgeoned to death in the store he faithfully guarded. They remembered the countless thefts, frauds, and betrayals. To these voices, Edward was proof that intellect without morality produced not greatness, but horror. His death was a relief, a final act in a decades-long reign of deception. But others were unsettled. They could not forget his eloquence in court, his sweeping claims about language, his uncanny ability to command a room. Some whispered that his execution was a loss to science, that America had squandered a potential Darwin or Newton by failing to harness his genius. His universal language, though incomplete, fascinated linguists who debated whether it had merit. Was he a murderer who happened to be smart, or a visionary undone by his own demons? In saloons, churches, and town squares, the debate flared. Moralists used Edward's story as a cautionary tale, a reminder that intelligence was meaningless without virtue. Educators saw it as proof that talent must be nurtured with character. Phrenologists and scientists, eager for physical evidence, focused on his brain. The execution did not silence Edward Rulloff. It immortalized him. When Edward's body was removed from the gallows, it was not sent quietly to the grave. Instead, it became the subject of one of the strangest scientific afterlives in American history. Phrenology, the 19th century pseudoscience of measuring skulls to interpret intellect and personality, was at its height. To phrenologists, the size and shape of Edward's head held the key to his paradox. How could one man contain such towering genius and such chilling cruelty? Perhaps the answer lay not in morality, but in biology. His brain was measured, weighed, and dissected. The results stunned observers. At approximately 59 ounces, Edward Rulloff's brain was declared one of the largest ever recorded in human history, second only to the legendary case of the French writer Georges Cuvier. Scientists marveled at its size, suggesting it explained his intellectual gifts. To phrenologists, this was vindication. Edward had been marked by nature as a genius. But the discovery posed troubling questions. If a brain of extraordinary size could belong to a murderer, what did that mean for the theory that intellect equated to moral superiority? Edward's life shattered the comforting belief that intelligence and goodness went hand in hand. Instead, his preserved brain sat as a grotesque exhibit of duality, proof that brilliance could coexist with brutality. The brain was eventually preserved in formaldehyde and displayed in Cornell University's Wilder Brain Collection, where it remains one of the most famous specimens. Visitors gawked at the relic, horrified, yet fascinated. Was this the seat of genius or of evil? Could science ever untangle the threads? Edward himself would have relished the irony. His lifelong quest was to leave a legacy through language and intellect. In the end, his legacy survived, not in his writings which faded into obscurity, but in the physical organ that had both elevated and damned him. By the late 19th century, Edward Rulloff had already transcended his crimes to become myth. Newspapers retold his story with lurid embellishments. Pamphlets painted him as a bogeyman, a symbol of the dangers of unchecked ambition. For storytellers, he was irresistible, part Faust, part Frankenstein, part common criminal. His myth revolved around the paradox of his life. How could a man who dreamed of uniting humanity through language also kill without remorse? How could a teacher and scholar transform into a burglar and murderer? This tension fascinated Americans who were living through an age of scientific progress and moral anxiety. For some, Edward became a cautionary tale about the dangers of intellect without conscience. For others, he was a dark romantic figure, like Poe's Madman or Shelley's Creations. Brilliant, cursed, doomed. Phrenologists and scientists cited him in lectures. Preachers thundered about him from pulpits. Novelists borrowed from his life when crafting villains torn between brilliance and crime. His skull and brain became carnival attractions in their own right. Visitors whispered about his last words, debated his motives, and shuddered at his crimes. Like Jesse James or Billy the Kid, Edward Rulloff joined the pantheon of American outlaws. But with a twist, he was not merely a bandit or gunman. He was the genius killer, a criminal whose weapon was not just violence, but intellect. Century criminal genius. To answer, one must compare him to contemporaries. Europe had seen its share of learned criminals, men who used education to deceive or manipulate. In America, however, Rulloff stood apart. Outlaws of the frontier like Jesse James relied on guns and gangs. Swindlers relied on charm and disguise. But Edward blended scholarship with savagery. His crimes were not driven by hunger or revenge, but by a bizarre sense of destiny, the belief that his work justified any act. In this, he resembled figures like Professor William Henry Ireland, a forger who duped scholars with fake Shakespeare manuscripts, or Dr. Thomas Neal Cream, the educated physician who murdered with poison. But Rulloff's blend of linguistic obsession and violent crime was unmatched. To criminologists, he became a case study in the failure of intellect as a safeguard against evil. Education did not save him from crime, it enabled it. He planned more cleverly, deceived more effectively, and rationalized more powerfully because of his intelligence. Even today, comparisons are drawn between Edward and modern criminal geniuses in literature and film. Characters like Hannibal Lecter, who blend refinement and savagery. Rulloff, in many ways, was their prototype. By the turn of the 20th century, Edward Rulloff was no longer just a man. He was a legend woven into American folklore. His name appeared in sensational crime anthologies. His story retold in dime novels and pulp magazines. In the world of academia, his preserved brain continued to intrigue scientists. For New Yorkers, especially in Binghamton and Ithaca, his shadow lingered. Old houses were said to be haunted by his victims. Parents warned children about the genius killer, as if he were a ghost lurking in the woods. In Dryden, whispers of Harriet's fate persisted long after her disappearance. Some claimed her spirit lingered, seeking justice that never came. Universities debated his unfinished linguistic manuscripts, though most scholars dismissed them as the work of a man too blinded by obsession. Still, the myth of what might have been clung to him. Could he have been a great linguist if not for crime? Or was crime his true nature, with scholarship a mask? In American folklore, Edward Rulloff sits uneasily between categories. He is not romanticized like Jesse James, nor reviled like Jack the Ripper. Instead, he is remembered as something more unsettling. Proof that genius is not inherently good, that brilliance can be monstrous. His story endures precisely because it resists easy morality. Even today, in museums, in academic studies, and in whispered tales, Edward Rulloff's name lives on. The genius killer, a man who dreamed of uniting language, but whose own life was nothing but division, blood, and ruin. When Edward Rulloff's body was cut down from the gallows in May 1871, it did not enter the earth quietly. His corpse was claimed almost immediately by science. In a time when medical schools, phrenologists and anatomists fought fiercely for cadavers, Rulloff's body was more than a curiosity. It was a prize. Doctors and scientists saw in him the perfect specimen, a man whose intelligence had been undeniable, whose crimes had been monstrous. To them, his corpse was not a vessel of sin, but of answers. His brain, as noted, was weighed at nearly 60 ounces, one of the largest human brains on record. To phrenologists, this confirmed their theory: large brain, great intellect. But there was a problem. If brain size equaled moral and intellectual superiority, how could one of the greatest criminal minds of the 19th century also possess one of the largest brains? Did this not undermine the very foundation of their claims? For weeks, newspapers debated this paradox. Some argued that Rulloff proved genius could exist without morality, that intellect was a tool that could be bent toward good or evil. Others clung desperately to phrenology, insisting that while his intellect was vast, his moral faculties had been stunted, perhaps reflected in the shape of his skull. His preserved brain, floating eerily in a glass jar, became a relic of both science and spectacle. Crowds who had once demanded his execution now flocked to see the organ that had both astonished and horrified. Was this glass-encased brain the seat of his universal language? Was this the source of the cunning that outwitted sheriffs and scholars alike? In Ithaca, New York, his brain became a permanent exhibit at Cornell University's Wilder Brain Collection, studied by generations of scientists. To this day, it remains one of the most famous specimens in American scientific history, a relic of a man whose body died, but whose mind lived on as an object of fascination. The late 19th century saw the birth of modern criminology, and Edward Rulloff's story was central to its development. Before his case, criminals were often divided neatly into brutes and deviants, their crimes explained away by poverty, drunkenness, or lack of education. Rulloff defied all categories. Here was a man who spoke multiple languages, who lectured on philosophy, who had once been a respected teacher. He was no illiterate thug, and yet he committed acts as cold-blooded as any outlaw on the frontier. His case forced criminologists and moral philosophers alike to grapple with unsettling questions. Was genius inherently moral? Could intellect itself become a weapon? Cesare Lombroso, the Italian criminologist whose theories on the born criminal shaped early studies of deviance, cited cases like Rulloff's as evidence of the criminal genius, a figure who used intelligence for predation rather than progress. In America, criminology lectures in the 1870s and 1880s often invoked his name. He became a test case, a cautionary tale, and a living paradox in the literature of law and punishment. Even as criminology matured, Rulloff remained a reference point. By the early 20th century, psychologists began analyzing him retrospectively. Some described him as a sociopath avant la lettre, a man incapable of empathy but capable of rationalizing every act in service of his ego. Others framed him as a narcissist whose obsession with his destiny excused every cruelty. In this way, Edward Rulloff became more than a man. He became a framework, a puzzle for criminology to solve, a figure against which theories of crime, intellect, and morality could be tested. For decades after his execution, Rulloff's story simmered quietly in local folklore and academic corners. The Wilder Brain Collection preserved his physical remains, but his legend faded from the national stage. By the turn of the 20th century, the age of dime novels had passed, and newer criminals, gangsters, bank robbers, serial killers, captured the public's imagination. Yet he was not forgotten. In Binghamton and Dryden, his name persisted in whispers. Old houses were called Rulloff's haunts. Parents scolded misbehaving children by warning them about the genius killer. His brain in Ithaca remained a silent monument, waiting for rediscovery. That rediscovery came in waves. In the mid-20th century, historians and true crime writers began to revisit his case. They saw in him not just a murderer, but a symbol of 19th century anxieties, the clash between science and morality, intellect and crime. Academic articles emerged, dissecting his linguistic ambitions and his legal trials. By the late 20th century, Rulloff's story had resurfaced in books, documentaries, and even local businesses, most notably Rulloff's restaurant and bar in Ithaca, a popular college hangout named after the infamous criminal. His name, once feared, became commercialized, a quirky nod to a local legend. Students drank beer under a sign bearing the face of a murderer whose brain floated just blocks away. The rediscovery of Edward Rulloff revealed a deeper truth. America never fully lets go of its monsters. Instead, it reinterprets them for new eras. Modern psychology offers frameworks that 19th century phrenologists lacked, and Edward Rulloff's case has become fertile ground for retrospective analysis. What kind of man was he truly? Some see him as a textbook narcissist. His belief in his universal language consumed his life, his sense of destiny justifying lies, thefts, and murders. To Edward, the work came first. People were expendable. Harriet, his wife, became a casualty of his obsession, her life erased when it conflicted with his control. Others diagnose him as a sociopath. He showed little remorse, manipulating those around him with ease, charming juries and intimidating judges. He used his intellect not for creation, but for domination. His genius was real, but it was weaponized. Still, others argue he may have had an antisocial personality disorder, a blend of charm, cunning, and cruelty. His obsession with linguistics was not mere scholarship, but compulsion, perhaps bordering on delusion. And yet, what unsettles psychologists most is that Edward Rulloff does not fit neatly into any box. He was not insane, in the legal sense. He was not unintelligent, far from it. He was both rational and monstrous, brilliant and brutal. He embodies the uncomfortable reality that intellect and morality are not intrinsically linked. For criminologists and psychologists alike, he remains a case study in duality, a reminder that the human mind can be both luminous and lethal. Edward Rulloff's life, crimes, and brain continue to echo in modern culture. His preserved brain remains one of Cornell University's most famous artifacts, drawing thousands of visitors and sparking countless debates in classrooms. True crime podcasts, fascinated by his contradictions, retell his story to new audiences. Historians publish fresh biographies, framing him within broader cultural shifts of the 19th century. In literature and media, he lives on in archetypes. The brilliant but murderous scholar, the refined killer with an obsession, the criminal who dazzles even as he destroys, all owe something to the real-life Edward Rulloff. From Gothic novels to psychological thrillers, his shadow is visible. In Ithaca, the restaurant bearing his name became a landmark, cementing him as part of local lore. College students who may never have heard of Harriet or Merrick know the name Rulloff as a place to eat and drink, unaware or unbothered that it honors a murderer. But perhaps the greatest legacy is the lesson he embodies. Rulloff forces us to confront an uncomfortable truth. Genius is not virtue. Brilliance can shine in the service of evil as easily as good. His story endures not because of what he built nothing, but because of what he destroyed and the terrifying brilliance with which he destroyed it. From the gallows in 1871 to the glowing screens of today's true crime documentaries, Edward Rulloff's name lingers. He was a man who sought immortality through language but found it instead through infamy. The genius killer, a man who showed the world that brilliance and blood can flow from the same source. More than 150 years after Edward Rulloff's execution, his story remains a subject of active debate among historians, criminologists, psychologists, and cultural critics. The fascination is not just with the murders he committed, though they were chilling enough, but with the contradictions he embodied. He was, by all accounts, a man of extraordinary intellect, yet he was also a man capable of cruelty and violence. Scholars continue to ask, how do we reconcile these two identities? Historians approach Rulloff as a man shaped by his era. Mid-19th century America was a nation in flux. Industrialization, civil war, and scientific revolutions created a society both hopeful and unsettled. In this context, Rulloff becomes a reflection of the anxieties of his time. His obsession with a universal language mirrors the 19th century faith in reason and progress, while his violence represents the dark underbelly of ambition unchecked by morality. Some historians argue that his story is less about Rulloff himself and more about how society responded to him. Newspapers sensationalized his crimes not only because of their brutality, but because they challenged prevailing assumptions. If education and intellect were supposed to civilize, how could a scholar also be a killer? For historians, Rulloff embodies the cultural clash between Enlightenment ideals and the grim realities of human behavior. Criminologists, meanwhile, treat Rulloff as a case study. Early theories of criminal behavior often used him as an example of the criminal genius, an anomaly who used intellect for predation rather than progress. In modern criminology, he is re-evaluated through the lens of psychological profiling. Was he a sociopath, a narcissist? Did he suffer from delusional obsession with his linguistic theories? Criminologists also use him to highlight the limits of early justice systems. In an age before modern forensic science, Rulloff was able to evade capture multiple times, living under false identities and manipulating legal loopholes. His eventual execution was as much a statement of public frustration as it was a triumph of justice. Psychologists often return to Rulloff because his case unsettles neat categories. Unlike many violent offenders, he was neither illiterate nor impulsive. He could plan meticulously, charm convincingly, and write with eloquence. His violence was not random but instrumental, used to protect his secrets, silence threats, or assert dominance. Some suggest he represents a form of malignant narcissism, a personality type that combines grandiosity, lack of empathy, and willingness to destroy others in pursuit of personal goals. His obsession with his linguistic work, which he believed would change the world, might be viewed today as delusional fixation, and yet the work itself had substance. He was not inventing nonsense. He was genuinely skilled in languages, making the psychological picture all the more complex. For cultural critics, Rulloff transcends biography to become symbol. He represents the uneasy relationship between genius and morality, intellect and danger. In literature, his archetype appears repeatedly: the brilliant villain, the cultivated killer, the scholar who destroys rather than creates. They argue that the continued fascination with Rulloff says as much about us as about him. Society is drawn to stories where brilliance and evil intersect, perhaps because they challenge our assumptions about intelligence as inherently good. In this sense, Rulloff becomes a mirror, forcing each generation to confront the unsettling possibility that intellect can be divorced from ethics. Even now, scholarly conferences occasionally feature papers on Edward Rulloff. His preserved brain at Cornell remains a teaching tool, not only in Anato, but in discussions of ethics and criminal psychology. Should we venerate the organ of a murderer because it was large? Should scientific curiosity override moral disgust? Edward Rulloff occupies a peculiar place in the annals of American crime. He was neither the most prolific killer nor the most notorious. Figures like Jesse James or later serial killers would eclipse him in scale and infamy. Yet Rulloff endures because he defied the stereotypes of his era. He was not an outlaw with a gun or a drifter with a knife. He was a teacher, a linguist, a man of books and ideas. In this sense, his story stands apart. Most 19th century American criminals were products of poverty, frontier lawlessness, or sheer desperation. Rulloff, by contrast, had access to education and possessed talents that could have secured him a respectable place in society. This makes his descent into crime all the more haunting. He chose murder not out of starvation or circumstance, but as a means of control and concealment. His killings were deliberate, rationalized by his ego and his ambitions. This divergence is why he is remembered as the genius killer. The label captures the paradox. He was both elevated and debased, a man of intellect who committed acts usually associated with the uneducated or brutish. In the mythology of American crime, this paradox ensures his unique place. His hanging in Binghamton was not just a punishment, it was cultural theater. Thousands gathered to watch, and newspapers across the country carried the story. For many, his death symbolized the triumph of morality over intellect misused. The public craved the spectacle because it resolved the tension he represented. By hanging the genius killer, society reaffirmed its faith that evil, no matter how intelligent, would not prevail. Yet, paradoxically, the execution also cemented his legend. Far from being erased, his name lived on in print, in folklore, in scientific collections. The very act meant to end him gave him a kind of immortality. Rulloff's story also bridges two eras of American crime. He belonged to the 19th century of phrenology, public hangings and frontier justice, but he also foreshadowed the 20th century fascination with psychological profiling and the inner workings of the criminal mind. In this way, he is a transitional figure. Before Jack the Ripper horrified London or the 20th century produced its infamous serial killers, America had Edward Rulloff, the criminal who forced society to ask not just what a killer did, but why. He was, in essence, an early prototype of the criminal mind that modern true crime media endlessly dissects. Where does Rulloff stand among America's infamous figures? He may not be as well known today as Jesse James or Al Capone, but among scholars of true crime, he holds a distinguished if unsettling place. He represents a rare type of criminal, the intellectual predator, the scholar-turned-killer. In the pantheon of American crime, he is the cautionary tale that intellect is no safeguard against evil. If anything, his genius made him more dangerous. He could manipulate, evade, and rationalize with a skill that ordinary criminals lacked. Ultimately, Rulloff's role in American crime history is to personify the disquieting truth that intelligence alone does not civilize. His story endures precisely because it unsettles. He forces us to confront the possibility that brilliance and brutality can reside in the same mind, that the capacity for reason does not guarantee morality. In this way, Edward Rulloff is not just a footnote in history. He is a symbol, a reminder that genius without conscience can be as deadly as ignorance armed with violence. His place in American crime is secure, not because of the number of his victims, but because of the questions he continues to raise. Edward Rulloff's death on the gallows in 1871 should have been the end of his story. The state of New York had closed its account with him, the law had done its work, and his victims, though never fully avenged, had at least seen their killer punished. Yet paradoxically, his death only marked the beginning of a new chapter. In the decades that followed, Rulloff lived on, not as a man but as a legacy, a specimen, a cautionary tale, and an enduring puzzle for scholars and society alike. Perhaps the most macabre element of his legacy is his brain. Removed after his execution, it was studied and preserved, eventually finding its way to Cornell University. There it became a point of scientific curiosity. At 59 ounces, it was one of the largest human brains ever recorded. Scientists marveled, measured, and speculated. Did its size explain his brilliance? Could its peculiarities account for his criminality? Students and researchers came to see it, sometimes with morbid fascination. For some, it was a reminder of the link between anatomy and intellect. For others, it was a symbol of science's inability to explain morality. The brain in its jar became a relic, both of Rulloff and of the 19th century's obsession with phrenology and the physical roots of genius and crime. Beyond his crimes, Rulloff's unfinished linguistic theories continued to surface in obscure academic circles. Manuscripts he left behind showed a serious attempt to codify a universal language. He believed that by uncovering the root structures of words, he could reveal a universal grammar shared by all tongues. Though his ideas were incomplete and often eccentric, some linguists acknowledged his talent. He was not a crank in the sense of having no substance. He had insights, but they were overshadowed by his obsession and his crimes. His work sparked occasional debates. Should genius be measured by intent or by completion? Could Rulloff's ideas have blossomed into something revolutionary, if not for his criminal path? Or was his linguistic project simply another manifestation of his delusional self-importance? These questions kept his intellectual legacy alive, albeit in the shadows. In local folklore, Rulloff became almost a ghostly presence. Stories about him circulated in Dryden, Binghamton, and beyond. Some painted him as a cautionary tale for wayward youths. See what happens when pride and arrogance lead a man astray. Others romanticized him as the doomed genius, a man too brilliant and too cursed for his time. Newspapers and writers occasionally resurrected him, especially during periods when society once again grappled with the uneasy marriage of intellect and violence. In this way, Rulloff became more than a historical figure. He became a cultural archetype. The persistence of his legacy reveals a deeper truth. Edward Rulloff unsettles because he defies our categories. We want criminals to be brutish, crude, and ignorant. We want scholars to be noble, refined, and safe. Rulloff was both at once, and that contradiction keeps him alive in memory. He is not merely a man of the past. He is a question we still wrestle with in the present. As his life and legacy are examined, the paradox at the core of Edward Rulloff becomes clear. He embodied both the highest aspirations of human intellect and the lowest depths of human cruelty. The tension between these poles is what gives his story its enduring power. It is easy to admire Rulloff's intellect, his ability to master languages, his ambition to create a universal linguistic system, his persuasive charm. All of these qualities mark him as exceptional. Yet admiration turns to horror when we remember that these same qualities enabled him to kill, deceive, and manipulate. His scholarship and his violence were not separate threads. They were interwoven. He used his intellect to evade justice, to rationalize his crimes, and to pursue his goals at the expense of human lives. He was not a brute who stumbled into murder. He was a deliberate killer who saw human beings as obstacles to be removed. In this sense, his intellect did not elevate him, it weaponized him. Perhaps the greatest tragedy of Rulloff is not just the lives he took, but the potential he squandered. Imagine if his energies had been channeled into productive scholarship. Could he have been remembered alongside great linguists? Could his theories have inspired new schools of thought? Instead, his legacy is forever tainted. His brilliance is remembered not for what it achieved, but for what it destroyed. This is the paradox. He had the tools of genius, but the heart of a killer. His life is both a monument to human potential and a warning about the dangers of intellect divorced from conscience. Rulloff's story also forces us to confront a moral question. Does intellect excuse evil? Some contemporaries argued that his genius should mitigate his crimes, that his execution was a waste of a brilliant mind. Others countered that genius without morality is more dangerous than ignorance, and that to spare him would be to devalue the lives he destroyed. This debate echoes through time. Even today, society struggles with how to treat gifted individuals who commit terrible acts. Do we separate the art from the artist, the discovery from the discoverer? Or do we hold them accountable as whole beings, refusing to excuse evil in the name of brilliance? Rulloff's life offers no easy answer, but it ensures the question remains alive. The story of Edward Rulloff does not end with the gallows, the jarred brain, or the fading newspaper clippings. It ends here, in the act of remembering. More than a century later, his name still provokes fascination, debate, and unease. In this final section, we close the arc by reflecting on what his story means for us today. We remember Edward Rulloff not because he was the most prolific killer or the most successful scholar. We remember him because he was both, and because that contradiction forces us to grapple with uncomfortable truths about humanity. He represents the dual nature of intellect, its power to illuminate and its capacity to destroy. In remembering him, we also remember his victims, Harriet Schute, her child, Frederick, Merrick, and perhaps others whose names are lost to history. Their silence is part of his legacy too. They are the shadows that remind us brilliance cannot erase blood. In the modern age, when debates rage about technology, artificial intelligence, and the uses of genius, Rulloff's story takes on renewed relevance. It is a cautionary tale about intellect untethered from morality. Brilliance without ethics is not progress, it is peril. The genius killer reminds us that the human mind, no matter how gifted, is dangerous if unmoored from compassion and conscience. As the curtain falls on Edward Rulloff's tale, we are left with a chilling yet necessary reminder. Genius is not virtue. Intelligence is not morality. Knowledge does not guarantee goodness. In fact, without a moral compass, knowledge can become the sharpest of weapons. Edward Rulloff's life, in all its brilliance and blood, asks us one final question. What do we value more, the greatness of the mind or the goodness of the heart? His story suggests that without the latter, the former is not only hollow but deadly. And so, we close the tale of Edward Rulloff, the genius killer, a man who dreamed of universal language but left behind universal warning. His brilliance dazzled, his crimes horrified, and his paradox endures. In remembering him, we are reminded not just of what he was, but of what we must strive not to become.